Hey everybody. So I have a bit of a confession to make. Over the last many months, since about, I don't know, February or January, a few months, I have not been reading Zarathustra as much, but rather I've gotten into another book. And I have to admit that I was really wrong on some things. I have to admit that I misjudged Carl Jung. I was, I think now, taken by false Jungians, people who claim to be Jungian, into Carl Jung. Looking back now, I don't think I've ever encountered someone who truly gets into the depth of what Carl Jung got into. For a long time, I thought my main criticism of Jordan Peterson, and people didn't really want to listen to me on this point, but my main criticism of him was that Peterson talked about Nietzsche a lot, but he wasn't forthcoming with his own audience, and he didn't tell them that, hey, just so you know, like Peterson should have said, hey, just so you know, even though I'm talking about Nietzsche here, Nietzsche would be very much opposed to Jordan Peterson's whole project. And Peterson himself was opposed to Nietzsche's project. I feel like Peterson wasn't honest about that. And that was my main criticism of Peterson from the start. I remember writing a blog post trying to share it with people. No one could defeat the logic of what I was saying. But no one wanted to talk about it either. So it was a real pickle. I was like, Peterson is not Peterson popularized Nietzsche, and for someone who popularizes him, I always felt that Peterson should be honest with his audience about how divergent they are in their ultimate goals. Because at the end of the day, Peterson was still a moralist, a Christian moralist. Now, you could call him a Gnostic, you could call him whatever, but he still was a moralist at the end of the day. And Nietzsche was an anti-moralist, and Peterson just he was just not honest with his audience about how diametrically opposed they were. So Peterson should have said, hey, I find Nietzsche really helpful in this way, but just so you know, at the end of the day, we're ideological enemies. That's what I think. I think Peterson should have told his audience that, and he didn't. But the one thing I didn't know at the time, because he didn't just popularize or make more popular Nietzsche. Peterson also popularized Carl Jung, talked about him a lot, talked about archetypes, talked about the shadow, talked about a lot of that. And indeed, for many years, for decades actually, I would encounter various YouTube videos or people talking about Carl Jung and his ideas, and I just eventually came to the conclusion that Carl Jung was just kind of a mystic, that he wasn't going to be as helpful to me as I thought he would be. And that's why I stuck with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche always seemed more blunt and straight up and more honest, directly honest. With the irony of Peterson is that he told his audience that honesty is a virtue and that you shouldn't lie and that you should always tell the truth. And the terrible irony is that I feel like Peterson's whole career is one big lie about Nietzsche. But now I would add to that lie, and I would say that Peterson's career is a lie also about Carl Jung. Peterson did not level with his own audience about the real depths of what who Carl Jung was and what he was actually on about. And I feel like Jungians all over the internet are like that too. And so it's funny, in the same way that I think modern Christianity hides the person of Jesus, and modern Judaism hides the story of the Torah and the prophets, I think modern Jungians hide Jung. I think modern Nietzscheans, so-called, hide Nietzsche. Because everyone loves to quote Nietzsche, for instance, when it suits them. Nietzsche says something profound. It's always the case that whenever I put up a video, like I remember redoing that video, Nietzsche versus the State, the new idol from Zarathustra, narrating that, and it did really well because it really resonates with people. You know, it sure resonates with me. I love that passage, but people love it. But when it comes to other passages in Zarathustra, people are very selective. You know, they're like, oh, Nietzsche said this. Isn't that brilliant? He was such a brilliant guy. And then Nietzsche says something really that they don't like, or they think is really offensive. You know, they hear what he says about women. I agree with almost everything Nietzsche says about women. I think he's just generally right. But others are like, they hear what he says about women and then they're like, well, let's not forget Nietzsche went mad. You know, it's like very selective. You want to say that, you want to point that out whenever he says something you disagree with. Well, I feel like it's the same with Carl Jung. I feel like people spend all their time pointing out really profound things Carl Jung says, and they just skip everything else. And I feel like I am in inheritance of this complete bullshit mess of Jungians, so-called. People are into Jung, but they don't want to actually deal with the hard things, the really hard things that Nietzsche taught, that Carl Jung taught. And so, interestingly, I've come to this conclusion. I guess you could say, though, these people who have misrepresented Jung in the same way that they misrepresent Christ or Nietzsche or whatever, in a sense, they are a vital villain. I'm so glad I wrote that book, actually, because the title alone, Vital Villain, the book is all about how in the Bible story, the divine uses villains to advance the story. Just like is the case with movies and books that we all like to read. The villain often advances the story. And that's why I called it The Vital Villain, which is about the Bible. By the way, pick up a copy, please. If you'd like to support this channel, please pick up a copy of that. That's the best way to do that. I'll put the links below. But check out The Vital Villain. So how have I come to this conclusion about Carl Jung, that I was essentially lied to? In the same way that I feel Peterson, whether knowingly or unknowingly, lies to his audience about Nietzsche, he also lies to his audience, whether knowingly or unknowingly. He lies to them about Carl Jung as well. And that's because I've been reading the Red Book. This is the reader's edition. There's no pictures in this one. You can buy another edition which does have pictures. I will be getting that one after I'm done this one. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. And let me tell you, this book has been an absolute trip. But it's been extra good after publishing my own book. And particularly after being aware of Nietzsche and being aware of the Bible story. So I've said this many times, just like Zarathustra is chock full of direct or indirect Bible references, so also is the Red Book. And I'm only 2/3 of the way through, but I've come to a conclusion. And I have to be honest about this. So I feel like I was lied to about Carl Jung. So I've met a new Carl Jung that I didn't know before. This is a new person as far as I'm concerned. The Carl Jung that everyone else talks about, to me, that guy no longer exists. Now, the Red Book is a new book. I think it was only published in like 2009 or 2010 or something. And it was obviously published posthumously, but it's actually a compilation of all the black books and whatever the writings of Carl Jung that he's compiled. But I've come to the conclusion that essentially Thus Spoke Zarathustra and the Red Book are on about basically the same thing. They're on about the same thing. They're looking for the same answers to the same problems, and they're just going about it in a different way. But they are both fundamentally, and this is where I feel like Peterson and others, they just lie. Whether knowingly, they're deceiving people, leading people astray, consciously or unconsciously, they're leading people astray. Because both Zarathustra and the Red Book are anti-morality, in the sense of anti-moralizing. That, but like I talked about in a previous video, Zarathustra, in my opinion, is extremely respectful to the archetypes of Christianity. I've talked about that. I would argue, but it's against the morality. So Nietzsche would call the morality moralic acid. So the Bible implies, this gives you an architecture, a framework in which the story operates, right? But the architecture itself is dripping with what Nietzsche would have called moralic acid. And people are being burned by the acid of morality. And so the Bible tells you what to do, but it also implies that you're a bad person if you don't. While Zarathustra greatly respects the architecture, the archetypes of the Bible stories, it respects the narrative elements, it respects the great figures, the overcoming, as I call it in my book, The Vital Villain, the adversity and triumph. He respects that greatly. But he's against the moralic acid that he sees to be spilled all over this architecture. It's just dripping with moralic acid. Now, I've come to the conclusion that the Red Book is essentially the same thing, but with a major qualifier here. And there's actually more than one qualifier, but I think this is the main one. Carl Jung also has a profound respect for the architecture of the archetypes of the Bible, of Christianity, and in Judaism. Carl Jung greatly respects that architecture. But there's a big difference between Zarathustra and the Red Book is Nietzsche's Zarathustra does go into the depths, indeed. It goes into depth psychology, it goes into the deeps. But it's also like rises way high into the sky. Zarathustra, with the most beautiful music in the world, as a commenter recently pointed out, and I thank you for that, Zarathustra is soaring on, as Jesus said, coming on the clouds of heaven. So also Zarathustra is soaring on the clouds. But the Red Book is not. Zarathustra and the Red Book, they both go into the depths, but unlike the Red Book, Zarathustra goes way up to the mountaintops. But, dog just happened back here. The Red Book does not go into the heights. The Red Book stays in the depths. The Red Book is very content to go into hell and sort everything out there. And another distinction I would mention is that with the Zarathustra, you can see Nietzsche's Germanness coming through. You can see in some ways he's not a typical German because he hints at subtle archetypes in the Bible, of the Bible in Zarathustra all the time. But in other ways, he's more of a hatchet man. He just wants to excise this malignant tumor in us called morality. He wants to just cut it out. Particularly though in his other books, Nietzsche, particularly in the Antichrist, for instance, which I mentioned, he really just takes he's like going through a forest and he's just hacking at the branches and just to clear a path. So he's like hacking away at morality, just cutting it off. While in the Red Book, I would argue, contrary to the implications of people like Peterson and the like, in the Red Book, Jung's not doing that. So Nietzsche is a very typical German in the sense that he's really, a stalwart German flying to the heights, and he's really just conquering and smashing morality. He's a philosopher with a hammer, right? But Jung is more about, I would call Jung is still also about getting rid of that morality. But if I could use a metaphor, I would compare it to like the earwax in your ear. Like a long time ago, I had a buildup of earwax problem because it was building up and I was stupid. I was one of the stupid people. You put a Q-tip in and you make it worse and it just compacts and compacts. Anyway, I had to go see an ear specialist and, they do the pump thing and eventually it comes out. But if you have to use this metaphor, if you have the proper amount of wax in your ears, you don't use a force to get rid of excess. You use moisture, and you just let it fall out in time, And one day you'll be walking along, and all of a sudden the earwax will just fall out of your ear, and that'll be very, delightful. A happy ending for you. But it just kind of falls out, And that's why they recommend when you have a bath or a hot tub or something, or a shower, that lots of water gets in there and then it moistens things up and then starts to fall out. Rather than going in with, you know, an intrusive or a surgical means to get rid of that. Some people get so compacted that they have to have surgery to get that removed. And that, I can't imagine, that would just hurt like hell. That would be terrible. But that is basically Jung's perspective, is not to smash, not to philosophize with a hammer, but rather Jung's perspective is to weave a story and a narrative, to take the narratives that came before and weave it in a certain way that does not go to the heights that Nietzsche does, but stays in the depths. And then the morality, I think his goal is that keep and honor the archetypes of the Bible, but then the morality itself will eventually just fall off. So both are actually shooting to the same ends. And I've heard people get into the Red Book or talk about it, and they just don't understand what he's doing. People who even claim to be Jungian, they just don't understand. This is anti-morality, both of them, both Nietzsche and Jung. This is anti-moralizing, without question. And this is hard for me to say because I've been into Zarathustra for so long, but I'm coming to the conclusion, in light of everything that's been happening over the past while, like, I think what I needed actually was I needed Nietzsche, I needed Zarathustra, but I think I needed Jung's approach. A lot of weird things have been happening when I've been reading this book. A lot of weird things, really weird. Like, I'll be talking to someone about a particular topic, whether it's online or in real life, and then like the day of, or the next day, or next couple days afterwards, I'll be reading the Red Book, and that topic will come up. That's happened many times. It's weird. It's like the never-ending story. It's like, you know, it's like Bastian's reading the book, and he's living through the experience of Atreyu, but there's a point in the movie, at least, I'm not familiar with the book, but there's a point in the movie where Atreyu looks in the mirror and he sees in the mirror Bastian looking back at him, the guy reading the book. And in that sense, this book is not a book of the heights. This book is a very creepy, almost creepy, not creepy in a bad way, but creepy in the sense that I would say you don't read the Red Book, but rather the Red Book reads you. But particularly especially well if you already know the Bible archetypes, and it's also extremely helpful if you know Zarathustra. So if you get to the Red Book after all that, well, this is just something I didn't anticipate. I have to admit that I was misled by the Jungians, who have characterized him as a mystic. And in the same way that I think Christians have really made a bad name out of Christ, it's just terrible. I think the Jungians have really ruined Jung, and I blame Peterson particularly. I think Peterson is a perfectly fine clinical psychologist. He's really good, but I think he's really stepped out of his league entirely. And so, but what I wanted to say is that both the Red Book and Zarathustra are entirely anti-morality, but Zarathustra is like this glorious ascent up to the heavens and a descent into hell, while the Red Book, you know, being red, it's covered in blood, is mainly just about the depths and not about ascending to hell. In fact, Jung called the heights of Zarathustra morbid. Now, whether you agree with that or not, it doesn't really matter. I must admit, though, that this has really profoundly helped me. And but I'm glad, though, that I got into Zarathustra before that. But anyway, both are pro-Christian in the sense that they respect profoundly the archetypes of Christianity, but both are, in a sense, anti-Christ, both the Zarathustra and the Red Book, in that they are profoundly anti-morality. They want to take that architecture that religion set up and they just want to cleanse it from all the moralizing, the moralic acid. Both Jung and Nietzsche are like that. And I feel like a reckoning now is coming, because people have been hiding under the name of Nietzsche. People have been hiding under the name of Jung. And they don't want to face the hard truths that are there, in the same way that people hide clearly in the name of Christ. If you made it this far, thanks for listening.